Welcome back to Black Bear Forge. Today I would like to continue our discussion on getting set up in blacksmithing with some budget-friendly tools and some basic materials. Last time we really looked at the tools and kind of introduced the concept of buying tools on a limited budget and making just enough stuff to pay yourself back for those tools and then take the next step in your evolution. We'll talk a little bit about some different tools, and I'll look at some really budget hacksaw blades and files just to see if they're worth the price. I was working with some Harbor Freight hacksaw blades. They're bimetal blades, and I managed to get through all 40 cuts with a single blade. So that's not too bad. That's about what I would expect. And it's starting to feel a little bit dull, but I think I'm going to go ahead and cut that piece of S7 tool steel in half with it. That should be annealed tool steel the way you buy it. And this should cut it just fine. Then we'll talk a little bit about tools and make a couple of tools that you're going to need to complete these projects. Now, when I made my initial purchase from Blacksmith Supply, I bought the 300mm wolf jaw tongs, and these end up being a little bit small for 3/8 material. So I went back and I ordered the 400mm version, and these are ideally suited for the 3/8 bar stock. These are great grip on this. They'll be just the thing. So hopefully you haven't already bought the 300mm version. For what I'm doing, the 400mm is better. Holds it sideways. It'll hold the hooks while you're working on those. And as an added bonus, it's close enough for forging the tools out of that 1/2" S7. So for everything we're doing in this is the only pair of tongs you're going to need. In the future, you will need more tongs, and you're going to want to learn to make your own tongs. But for starting off and learning the basic skills of blacksmithing, I think having a good store-bought pair of tongs to work with is really the way to go. And that way, when you get around to making your own tongs, you know how they're supposed to work. Now, I showed some measuring devices in the last video. If you don't own a tape measure or a ruler, you're going to have to buy something or figure out some way to get consistent measurements. Once you've cut one of these pieces of bar to length, you can use it to measure all the rest of them. And a little variation probably isn't going to hurt anything. But a tape measure or ruler is going to make your life easier. You can use a Sharpie marker, a silver pencil, or a welder's soapstone. Soapstone's usually available pretty cheap. Now, with safety in mind, a lot of people mention safety glasses. I talk about safety glasses in every single video, so I didn't think I needed to say something separate for this series. But if you're just getting started and you don't own safety glasses, you should buy a set of safety glasses. They're usually available pretty inexpensive. And if you're already doing woodworking or some other tool-related hobby, hopefully you already own safety glasses. Same thing goes with hearing protection if your anvil is particularly loud. And these little anvils have a pretty annoying ring unless you do something really good to quiet them down. My preference is over-the-ear hearing protection. I find these a lot more comfortable, highly effective. Earplugs are a lot cheaper. You get the little foam earplugs really cheap. A lot of places will give those away free just because they've got boxes and boxes of them. And again, if you're engaged in some other craft work, there's a good chance you already have the hearing protection you like to wear. But if not, I would recommend having some hearing protection, safety glasses. Wear non-synthetic clothes, something that won't melt if a hot spark hits them. You don't want plasticky clothes melting to your skin. Better to burn a hole through a cotton shirt or a cotton pair of pants. Good leather shoes, preferably boots with tops high enough that they're under your pant leg, so if you drop something, you can't accidentally drop it into the top of your shoe. Now, as far as gloves go, that's kind of a double-edged sword, and I've done videos talking about gloves and how gloves can actually contribute to injuries, contribute to problems in forging. They're going to affect your hammer control. They're going to make it a lot harder to learn. So I usually don't bother to wear gloves unless I really need them. If you're working on something that's really big, got a lot of radiant heat, you're going to have to wear gloves. If you're trying to handhold material that's too hot to hold by hand, it may be too hot to hold with a glove. And if you burn yourself through the glove and drop that piece of material, the glove's going to stay hot and you're still going to be burning yourself. Of course, the biggest danger with gloves is getting it stuck in some sort of moving machinery. A glove will not give up in most cases until that piece of machinery has sucked your hand in and stalled the machinery or tripped the breaker. So avoid gloves around machinery. Over here, this is all hand tools. There is no machinery over here, so that isn't really a risk. But gloves will affect your hammer control. It's going to be harder to do good work, and it's going to be harder to learn. So at least on your hammer hand, I prefer not to wear a glove unless I absolutely have to. Anyways, let's get on to making a couple of tools out of that S7. I want to make a punch for punching holes for a fastener for the hooks. And I want to make a chisel just because you will use a chisel frequently. This is 1/2-inch diameter material. It's a little bit light, but for simple tools, for these small projects, it'll work fine. And we're only using 6 inches of material. I would prefer to use a little bit more material, but this is the length and the diameter that Blacksmith Supply had, so it was easy to order it when I was ordering the hammer and the tongs. As you continue your journey with blacksmithing, you're going to make hundreds of tools like this, and you can certainly use other materials besides the S7. A lot of people like coil springs. The problem is you're not going to heat up a coil spring in this little forge. You're going to have to cut it in sections first. Coil spring is hard steel, so you're not going to cut it with a hacksaw. If you have an angle grinder with a cutoff disc, it's easy to do that. Heat up the sections, straighten them on the anvil, and that's not a bad way to go. But if your only cutting tool is a hacksaw, you're probably not going to be able to use coil spring at this point. It's a good idea to take a moment and knock the burrs off the end, particularly on the tool steels for tools, so you don't forge some sort of a cold shut into the material. And for that matter, if you take the time to file a little bevel around one end of the tool, that will be the struck end, and you won't have to do any forging to that end. We're only going to forge the working end. S7 is an air hardening steel. You need to keep it hot while you're working with it. This forges best at the higher heat ranges. As it starts to cool, get it back in the forge and bring it up to heat again. This punch is just like any other taper. We're going to forge it out to square, then octagon, and then we're going to finally go to round. You want to make this as perfect as you can off the anvil. If you have a grinder, it's pretty easy to correct any odd spots. But if you're using this basic setup that we've been looking at here, you're going to have to clean this up with a file, and the better you can do at the anvil, the less work you're going to have to do with a file. And again, S7's air hardening, it's going to be a lot harder than a piece of annealed 5160 or 01 or A33 or something like that. So do the best job you can on both of these tools right from the anvil. The chisel is just a simple flat taper. I'm making it about 3/4 of an inch wide, and I'm trying to keep the edges kind of parallel just because I think it looks better than a big flaring end on a chisel, just up to what you want your tools to look like. And finally, I'm going to take the very edge down a little bit and start putting the final bevel on there at the anvil again, so I don't have to spend extra time filing that. If I was doing this with the belt grinder, I'd just grind that in. Because the S7 is an air hardening steel, and I can't normalize it like you would a lot of other steels, you just let them air cool and that makes them pretty soft, pretty easy to file. S7 is hardening when you're doing that. That is the hardening procedure. So to cool these a little slower and hopefully make them a little bit easier to file, I put them back in the forge, turn the forge off, and I'm going to let them cool down with the forge, and hopefully that will be less than fully hard. We'll still need to go back and harden and temper these after we do the filing on them, but I want them as soft as I can when I file them. Ideally, you go through a full annealing process, but that takes an electronic oven that's very controlled, and it cools it down incrementally over about 12 hours. This setup just isn't suited for that. For that reason alone, you might be better off using really simple steels, something like 1045, 5160. Those just weren't available at the same place I was buying the other stuff, so I went with what was readily available and affordable. There are lots of tool steels out there, and I've done lots of videos in the past on some of these others. If you're interested, I will link to a video right up here on working with 1045 to make some of these similar tools. And that's a water hardening steel, a lot easier to work with, very forgiving. Not going to hold up as well to heat or abuse as the S7 tools will, but it might be a good place to start. Just couldn't get that from Blacksmith Supply when I ordered this stuff. I let these tools cool completely so I could handle them. Then I filed them as cleanly as I could. The punch filed pretty easy, so it was a little bit softer than the chisel. By the time I was done with the chisel, the flat side of that cheap $3.50 Harbor Freight file was completely worn out. The round side hasn't been touched, so it can be used for something, but the flat side's no good anymore, and I think that speaks to the quality of the Harbor Freight files. I won't be buying any more of those. As I've mentioned, S7 is an air hardening steel. If you're using some other steel, you need to follow the proper procedure for that steel. But for the S7, you bring it up to a good bright orange, just set it in still air, let it cool. When it's cool enough to handle, we'll clean up the ends of those so we can see some tempering colors, and then we'll just put the struck end back in the forge at a real low heat and let those colors run a little bit, and that color indicates how hot it gets. We're going to bring it back up to about 450, 500 degrees, something like that. These are going to get tempered way back in use because they're going to get a lot hotter than we're tempering them. We just want to make sure they're not brittle at this point. That completes two very basic but completely functional blacksmithing tools, and these are tools that you will be using your entire blacksmithing career if you don't wear them out. But if you take care of them, these will last for years. Now, if you're thinking, wow, making tools right off the bat, that's a big step. Well, remember, we bought that extra piece of 3/8 material that we can practice on. The round taper for the punch is really no different than the round taper for the hooks that I was showing you in the previous video. It just doesn't come out to quite as much of a point, and of course it doesn't have the little curly Q on the end of it. But other than that, square to octagon to round, it's the same procedure, just in a piece of tool steel instead of the piece of 3/8 mild steel. We looked at another hook the other day, drawing a flat taper. If you've been practicing that, that's essentially the same thing as doing the chisel. All those little exercises transfer to the next project. So what you learn practicing making hooks with that first piece of 3/8 bar stock gives you the skills you need to make these tools. So make sure you do that before you tackle making these tools. Now, punching will be easier if you have a bolster. You can punch using the Hardy hole or Precut hole, but even if the Precut hole in this little anvil was up on the face where it should be, it's way too big for punching some of these hooks. The little thin finial on this hook will just collapse down into there, and you're going to have nothing but trouble getting a clean hole. You can do it that way. Drilling is actually my preferred way to do this, and I would much prefer to run a drill bit through there. But I have a drill press. If you don't have a drill press, you can do it with a hand drill. Don't have a hand drill, this is the way you have to go. Another tool that will make this easier is a bolster, and that's just a plate that goes on your anvil that has a much smaller hole. It's just a little bit bigger than the end of your punch, so you can get a really clean hole. And on these super thin finials, like this little spade finial on this hook, you can probably punch them cold. If you don't have materials to make a bolster out of handy, this may just be something that you have to adapt and work over the hardy hole or the Precut hole in your anvil. But I've got a piece of scrap material. When you go to the steel yard to buy this other stuff, a lot of times they have little cutoffs like this laying around that they would be happy to give you because they're just a pain for them to go around and pick up. But ask first, and if they charge for it, it's probably less than $1 a pound, and this weighs a few ounces. 1/4 inch would be minimum thickness for something like that. This is 1/2 inch. That'll make a really nice bolster. Again, it'll be a tool that we use for years, and we're going to use the punch to make the bolster. This is something you might want a glove for. This puts out a lot of radiant heat. It can be tough to line all this up, but with a little practice you'll get the hang of it. Now, a lot of you asked about wire brushes in the last video. That's kind of an optional thing. If you work these simple projects down below a scaling heat, so down close to a black heat, you're going to knock all the scale off of them, and you don't need to wire brush them. But if you'd like to wire brush them and you have a wire brush, that's just fine. These simple fine bristle brushes are pretty cheap, pretty easy to find. The real coarse ones that you frequently see me using in the videos are block brushes for the short bristled ones. They're made for cleaning butcher blocks. A lot of the blacksmithing suppliers have them. And the real long ones are casting brushes. The block brushes and the casting brushes cost a lot more than these, so it might be sort of up to your budget. But a little brush like this will get you through to start with. Now, I think that's all the tools that you need to get all of these projects finished. We're still going to need some sort of a finish, some paste wax, linseed oil, clear coat, whatever it is you want to put on them, and we'll talk about that when we actually forge all the projects. And then we're going to need to talk about how to market these. I thought I was going to get to that in this video, but there is so much information to cover that I don't want to overwhelm you. Heck, it kind of overwhelms me while I'm just thinking about what I need to do for the video. So we're going to leave this at a completion of setting up shop, getting your tools organized, getting the tools made. So the big thing right now is to take that extra piece of material, practice drawing out tapers, square, octagon, round, practice the flat tapers, practice turning those into hooks so you can work on the scrolling and all that stuff at the anvil. You get that down so that you're comfortable with it. And once you're comfortable, make the tools, harden and temper the tools, and then we'll be ready to get to work on the projects. So in the next video, that's what we're going to look at, is working on the projects. I've got a half dozen different things I'm going to try and make, and then see if I can make perhaps 60 items that can be put up for sale to cover the expense of all this stuff. Don't know if I'm going to be able to pull that off yet. We'll just have to wait and see. But if you're just looking at this for a hobby and you're not going to try and recoup your expense to further pay for the hobby, you're off and running. You're ready to go now. Have fun with it. But it's probably worth checking in the next video and following along, because there might be some fun projects for you in that. Now, once again, I will link to a bunch of this stuff down in the video description. I'll link to the little single burner, 2-burner forge from Vevor, this little anvil, this 30 kilogram, 66 pound anvil, the hammer and tongs from Blacksmith Supply. And if I can think of anything else you might need to get started, I'll link that too. As always, there are a lot of links further down in the video description for other suppliers of goods and materials for blacksmithing, combat abrasives, forge aprons if you wanted a leather apron, Blacksmiths Depot, Pay Tool, Centaur Forge, Abana if you want to join Abana. Lots of different links down there, so it's worth going through those if you're looking for some of those resources. I don't know if the next video here in Black Bear Forge will be about this project, or if I'm going to give you a little bit extra time to work on some of this stuff, do the practice, get the tools made, and maybe in 2 weeks we'll look at making these projects, and I'll get on to something else for next week. One way or the other though, I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you have time in your day to get out to your shop, make something, stay safe, wear your safety glasses. We'll see you for the next one.